This Week in Microbiology is brought to you by the American Society for Microbiology at microbeworld.org/TWiM.
Welcome to ICAAC Live, the discussion show that explores topics in infectious diseases. We're broadcasting today from San Francisco at the 52nd meeting of the Interscience Conference on Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy. That's ICAAC. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and today is September 10th, 2012. Joining me today is my co-host from This Week in Microbiology, Michael Schmidt.
Welcome, Vincent. It's good to be sitting next to you instead of through a Skype headset. And we normally discuss the weather, and I think the audience in the room will agree with us. This is what they refer to in my town as Chamber of Commerce weather. It's a crisp fall day outside. You couldn't ask for nicer weather for San Francisco.
Michael and I do a podcast This Week in Microbiology. We also do a couple of other podcasts on viruses and parasites. And the idea is these are casual conversations among scientists, which we record and we make available to everyone. It's all about science communication. And if I could, I'd like to quote Stuart Firestein, who's a neuroscientist at Columbia University. He has a wonderful book called Ignorance, How It Drives Science. And he says, science uses and requires public money. Scientists therefore have both a responsibility and, quite frankly, a necessity to educate the public, to engage them in the scientific enterprise. And that's what all of these podcasts are about, engaging the public. And we're very lucky to be able to do one here at ICAAC to show you how it works and to provide some good science to you and whoever is listening. So these shows are being live streamed at the moment. They'll be recorded and available for a long time for watching. So we'll be taking questions via Twitter. The hashtag is #ICAAC, ICAAC. Here periodically in the audience, if you have questions, we have a few roaming mics, which will take those. So both the audience here and those listening online can ask questions. So what we have done today is we've selected 3 speakers from this terrific ICAAC program. It's just a wonderful program. It's been going on since Sunday morning, and they represent a variety of fields. So we're going to chat with them about what they do. And starting here on Michael's left from Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, is John Brownstein. Welcome to ICAAC Live, John.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Just off the plane, right?
Just off the plane, half an hour ago.
All right. We'll get you warmed up.
All right.
Next to John, from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, he's the co-director of the Center for Tuberculosis Research, William Bishai. Welcome. William or Bill?
Bill.
Okay. It's baseball, right?
That's right.
We'll call him Bill. And finally, last but not least, over at the end, from the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, Professor of Pediatrics, Victor Nizet. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you for the invitation.
You haven't come far.
No.
Well, these are our panelists today. They work on quite varied topics, and we're going to dive right in and start talking. I think I'm going to do it alphabetically, so that puts you up first to bat, Bill. And we know that you work on tuberculosis. You actually gave a talk today. And I am relatively ignorant about tuberculosis. I know my father had it growing up in Europe, and there are many questions I have. So maybe we could start with a really basic TB 101, basic pathogenesis. How do you acquire it? Where does it go? And what happens?
So tuberculosis is an airborne infection, which puts it in relatively unique company. That is, it's a disease you can catch just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time and breathing air from someone else who has active tuberculosis. TB is a thing of the past here in this country, but as you mentioned, in our parents' and grandparents' generation, it was a very common problem. And while we're setting all-time record lows here in the United States, the rest of the world is going down in flames. It's achieving all-time record highs globally. It's currently the second leading cause of infectious death worldwide. But there's an asterisk there. Mm-hmm. That's because the WHO counts people who die of AIDS and tuberculosis under the AIDS column. So we should be number one.
So you're like Avis. You
That's right.
Just have to try harder.
Yeah, that's right. It's funny in this field, people brag about being the worst of the worst. I'm actually living in Durban, South Africa now, where we have very high rates of drug-resistant TB. And every time I rub elbows with other people in sub-Saharan Africa, it's we have more drug resistance than you do. And we always try to outdo one another in terms of being worst of the worst.
So in New York City subways, there's little chance that I'm going to get TB. Is that correct?
Unless you sit next to a homeless prison guard who has HIV.
Do it all the time.
Then you're at risk, Vincent.
Okay. And would I know if I were infected?
Probably not. So you did ask about pathogenesis, and I didn't answer your question.
Okay.
It's a very interesting disease. You get exposed, usually in childhood, in high-burden settings, like New York City subways. And you carry it around in a latent form, most immunocompetent humans. Where you're infected, there are still a few viable organisms in your body somewhere. But you're not sick, and you wouldn't know that you were infected except if someone came along and did a tuberculin skin test on you. And then, usually later in life, if you got elderly or immunocompromised, someone put you on a TNF inhibitor for your rheumatoid arthritis, or you contracted HIV or took a lot of steroids for asthma, you would get reactivation tuberculosis.
How about chemotherapy for cancer? Would that
would do it too, yeah.
Okay.
So my brother is firefighter paramedic in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. And when he was 21 years old, I remember visiting him, and it was wintertime, and he came out of the shower, and he was in his T-shirt, and he had just gotten his tuberculin skin test, because in the state of Illinois, they routinely skin test everyone, and he was
You're not supposed to do that, Michael. That's against CDC guidelines. It's supposed to be targeted testing.
Well, this was about 20 years ago. So I looked at him, and he was still living at home with my folks, and, tuberculosis to my parents' generation was a death sentence. I mean, you got banished to Arizona if you had tuberculosis. And so my mother was quite concerned, and I said to Greg, well, you're skin test positive. You're going to have to go to local health department, and they're going to probably put you on a regimen of drugs for 6 months. And he said, 6 months? Don't they just have one pill? And so 20 years have gone by, and so I guess I'm going to ask my brother's question. Why don't we have a pill?
Okay, well, that's a loaded question. We're here at ICAAC, where there are a lot of pharmaceutical companies. But the answer, I think, goes back to some genetics and the fact that the disease is going away in the rich economies. The genetics of it are that the organism, when TB is active, which your relative did not have, grows to very high abundances, over 1 billion organisms. And in one of Vincent's podcasts, I remember hearing about the spontaneous mutation rate and directed mutagenesis and whatnot. And it's estimated that in a population of 10 to the 9th bugs, there'll be 10 spontaneously resistant organisms, 1 in 10 to the 8th. And so you have to use multiple drugs, because if you use just one drug, those 10, you'll kill off, 99.999%, but there'll still be 10 left that will outgrow as resistant forms. So it's a disease you have to treat with multiple drugs. And in fact, I think we should be treating a lot more bacterial infections with multiple drugs. You go to the pneumococcal sessions here and scratching their heads about why is there so much pneumococcal resistance. It's because of the Z-Packs and the monotherapy that everybody takes. But that's a separate point. So the heyday was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There hasn't been a single new TB drug class since 69, I think, with rifampin. And it's a tough sell. If you're on the board of trustees of Pfizer, you have to answer to your shareholders. Why are you investing in a disease to make new drugs where there's no population of paying customers who will buy your drug? That may be changing. India, parts of Africa, Far East have a lot of a rising middle class who ride the subways, sit next to homeless prison guards with HIV, and are at risk.
Well, that's one of the frightening things, I think, is the emergence of the totally drug-resistant tuberculosis in India, where you have a high-density population, and as you point out, breathing is the principal risk factor for acquisition of tuberculosis, and there's not one of us in this room that cannot go without breathing. I mean, it's a really profound risk factor, and many of us in this room have worn N95 masks, which is the principal way you can protect yourself. And working in an N95 mask or walking in an N95 mask is not pleasurable.
It's no fun at a bar, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
So why don't we routinely use triple therapy as we do for HIV and AIDS?
So just back to some of the fundamentals, when you have that latent syndrome where you're infected, you have a positive skin test, you actually can use one drug. But now it's 9 months, not 6. And there are a couple of risks. You can get hepatitis. You're not supposed to drink alcohol. So one drug works, but that's because it's paucibacillary. There are maybe 100, 1,000 bacteria in your body. If you get active TB, when you have over 1 billion organisms, you have to use multi-drug therapy. And the problem has been over the decades is people start to feel better after a couple of weeks of multi-drug therapy. If you're in rural KwaZulu-Natal and you have to walk 4 hours to get to the clinic to get your next month's doses, you might feel better after 1 or 2 months and not really want to leave your family and walk so far to take some pills that you don't think are necessary. And that's so piecemeal incomplete therapy has led to the emergence of these totally drug-resistant strains, which are modern-day death sentence from infectious diseases. There are a couple of them out there. You can die of it.
How can you distinguish someone with a few hundred organisms versus active TB readily?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I have latent TB, or I had it. I took my
You're my
9
brother.
months. Yeah.
You're my brother.
So people who have latent TB feel fine, but people who have active TB are sick. And they're coughing, they're losing weight.
So in a developed country, someone who felt sick and they would go to their physician, how would they be diagnosed with TB?
What would happen in Baltimore most commonly is your doctor would say, here, take a Z-Pack, you're coughing. A good doctor might ask if you sat next to a homeless prison guard with HIV on the subway and might think about some rarer causes. Usually there's a series of misdiagnoses. Often it goes for many months. We had this in Johns Hopkins just a few months ago. Someone went 4 months before finally someone said, you should have gotten better by now. And so you'll ask for a sputum sample, look under the microscope. That can detect characteristic bacteria. You'll send the sample to the lab, and here's the problem. The bug takes 24 hours to divide once, 4 weeks to form a colony on a petri dish. So even the hottest diagnostic tricks take at least 10 days to 2 weeks to get a positive culture. So you need a good doctor who can say, okay, it's likely to be tuberculosis. I'm going to start you on treatment, and then we'll wait to see what the cultures show.
So we don't have CSI for TB.
No, it's a big need.
Yeah.
It's a big need. And it's something that could be solved with the tools that are out there.
So in that case, if you were diagnosed with active TB, then you would have triple therapy. Right? Quadruple therapy.
Times, yeah.
And then within 9 months, you said that would be resolved most likely if you stuck to the regimen, right?
That's correct. In fact, you can get away with 6 months. The short course therapy is 6 months.
Okay, so in countries where there isn't such good health care, this doesn't happen, and you don't do quadruple therapy. You do monotherapy, and then you select for resistance. Is that more or less the story?
Yeah, that's more or less the story.
Okay, so now there are highly drug-resistant strains, total drug-resistant strains, resistant to everything that we have available to us. Are they globally distributed, these strains, or?
They're focused in a couple of interesting places. Sub-Saharan Africa has a lot of resistance. India and China do as well. We brag in South Africa that it's more concentrated there. Numerically, India and China have more cases, but the population is much larger. And there's a lot of it in the former Soviet Union for some interesting reasons.
Are these mobile? Can they reach global?
It's a plane flight away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a famous case about 5 years ago of an Atlanta lawyer who went to get married on a Greek island, and just before he left, his doctor said, "You might have TB and it might be drug resistant. You shouldn't travel." And he went anyway. And then the story broke. He snuck back into the United States. So it was literally a plane ride away.
Oh, I know the moral of that story. Just don't get married. It's clear.
But he ended up in the Huskow in Denver, where they literally treated him under quarantine.
Yeah, and in fact, at this morning's session, the surgeon who took out part of his lung showed videos of how they do it these days. It was great. Microbiology is fun, but high-tech surgery is pretty sexy.
So the mutations that confer resistance, do they have a fitness cost that would prevent spread?
That's a great question, Vincent. We're not sure. That's the dogma, that nothing comes for free. There's no free lunch in microbiology. The animal models are broken. I do a lot of animal models, so I'm allowed to say that. But you can't really be sure in animal models. And plus, you got to think about whether you want your PhD student or postdoc infecting mice with extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis.
So the problem seems to be that we need more drugs as well, right? Is there drug development? Is there a big pipeline or a small pipeline?
Small pipeline. But a couple of big companies have surprised us over the last decade. They have had quiet programs to develop new drugs, and there are three exciting classes on the horizon. And there's been a lot of support from major government funders, including NIH. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done a lot to try to stimulate this field. So two drugs are actually being evaluated by the regulatory authorities, and maybe we'll get one or two of them next year, which would be a big breakthrough. And I always like to say that drug-resistant TB is just two new drug classes away from being eradicated.
So that brings up another question. Is this an eradicable disease? There's no animal reservoir, is that correct?
Indeed. There is a tiny animal reservoir, but the vast majority of it is human to human. And one of the problems is that latency problem. That you could cure everybody who has active TB. There's still a lot of people with latent TB. That's a big reservoir, and they're a source of continuing problems with new infections.
Was there a question on Twitter or in the audience?
Yeah, actually, first let's get to the question on Twitter. Twitter user Pseudoyan has a question regarding immunization programs. He says, China had active immunization for tuberculosis. Based on what's known now, is that effective? And also wants to know if you could talk about new vaccines.
I was going to ask that very question. I'm always very curious about the wonder that is BCG. And the rest of the planet, besides the United States, seems to be very comfortable using BCG to confer herd immunity against this horrific disease. What are your thoughts on BCG?
So BCG is a vaccine that was discovered by Calmette, the C, and Guérin, the G, and the B is for Bacille. They serially passed a culture of M. tuberculosis for about 15 years. And then they had the courage or craziness to infect a child whose parents had both died of tuberculosis with this live attenuated vaccine. You couldn't get away with that in 2012. And it worked. The problem is BCG has modest efficacy in preventing disseminated TB in children. It doesn't really help adults. And the best evidence for that is that we've been using it since the 20s, and there's more TB in 2012 than any previous year in history. So it's not enough.
So this is the vaccine that the Twitter listener is referring to that's actively being used in China as well as India today, and most of Europe, I think.
Most of the world, yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's the most widely given vaccine on the planet, and almost every baby who's born gets it, except in North America and a couple of European countries. And there is some big push, just like there is for HIV, to come up with a TB vaccine. The problem is we don't know what we're looking for. We're the proverbial blind man in a dark room. We don't know if there is human immunity to tuberculosis, and we don't know what the markers are that show that it's there, if it exists. And so it's a tough one. And what's going to happen, thanks to Gates and NIH and other funders, is they're just going to try a few vaccines in people and look for the endpoint markers that they think might show immunity and see if they correlate among the populations who don't get TB after they've been vaccinated.
Yeah, because it's a sort of a different vaccine than we're looking for HIV, where the vaccine for HIV, you want to prevent the infection. In the case of tuberculosis, we're just looking for the prevention of the disease, because tuberculosis doesn't wipe out your immune system once you acquire it.
Right.
So the correlates may be a little bit lower in terms of the bar that they have to reach.
That's very true, Michael. Yeah, it's obviously an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. My bet is on diagnose and treat. I hope to live to see a TB vaccine. That would be the long-term solution.
Well, in terms of treatment, if you were looking at your crystal ball thinking about the targets in tuberculosis to go after, I always have found mycobacteria to be a fascinating microbe simply because it grows so slowly. And if you scratch your head and think how antibiotics work, they always work best against actively growing, quickly dividing bacteria. And that's sort of not what TB does well. TB likes to hide, and it likes to just sit and say, okay, I'll make a message. And so what are your thoughts on targets?
Yeah, that's a tough one. TB is sort of a cross between Rumpelstiltskin, hibernating for many, many years and then waking up, and a Sherman tank.
Yeah.
And it just sort of grows slowly and inexorably. It's intracellular. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Probably a good vaccine is going to induce acquired cellular immunity. There are not that many examples, and getting a little bit out of my league, maybe Vincent can rescue me, of vaccines that work against intracellular bacteria. We're great at vaccines that neutralize toxins and vaccines that recognize polysaccharides.
The low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit has been harvested big time. Now we're left with the hard problems.
Victor, you wanted to say something?
Along the vaccine angle, Bill, I was wondering about whether the BCG vaccine, having some efficacy, could represent an initial scaffold for an effective vaccine by introducing on that background some key immune epitopes from MTB that would fortify it back up into the effective range.
Yeah, that's an idea that's out there to bolster BCG, to take the live attenuated vaccine and make it a little bit more potent. And then the other one is to take the virulent organism and try to attenuate it. And then a lot of people have thought about putting antigens for other diseases in there, because mycobacteria, in Freund's complete adjuvant, there's ground up mycobacterial
and we
antigens.
all know how wonderful Freund's is at eliciting an immune response.
Yeah.
It's like a sledgehammer hitting your head.
Right, so you could put a rabies epitope in there, or what your favorite disease, and maybe that's really.
How about HIV? You could get the double whammy.
There you go, and retire young. Yeah, no, I think it's an area. One of the problems is that, and this is a chronic problem in science, is that by the time you get to be my age, you're so specialized, you only know.
You're 30 years old. What are you talking
yeah,
about?
Thanks. Thanks. You made my week.
You look very young. Did you ever see a case of TB, Victor?
Oh, certainly. I used to volunteer in the TB clinic in San Diego County. We have quite a bit of disease just across the border in Tijuana. Surprisingly, about 40% of the TB we saw was not Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but its close relative, Mycobacterium bovis. And this is coming from contaminated dairy products because it's endemic in the cows there, and really without eradication, which was done in Great Britain to handle that problem several decades ago, you're not going to get on top of it. And there's this delicious queso fresco, queso blanco on the roadsides. And though everyone denies eating it, everyone, in fact, has sampled it. And it starts out with lymph nodes in the neck, but sometimes very severe gastrointestinal disease and even central nervous system disease in children.
It's treatable?
It's treatable, yes. We kind of use exactly the same approach. It's intrinsically resistant to pyrazinamide, so that makes a little bit of a difference in the treatment. But people have to think about it. You know, people don't have the same awareness. Think necessarily that a lymph node would be tuberculosis or abdominal pain would be tuberculosis in a young child.
Right.
Gives a whole new meaning to the word. Think horses and not zebras. And you know, one of the things when I talk with our medical students, I point out to them that, you know, for many years the U.S. Naval Academy had its own herd of dairy cattle that were certified to be free of M. bovis because the U.S. Navy was worried about its officer corps becoming infected with tuberculosis.
I had a photo they gave me when I completed my residency at Boston Children's, where John is right now, where you have a picture of the hospital, but right next to it is a pasture with the cows that ensured a safe milk supply for all the children that were being treated in the hospital.
Yeah, that's why we, you know, many of the major cities in the United States were strong supporters of pasteurization of milk when it was a new concept.
Right.
Because it really works.
We have a question from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Christian Søberg, I come from Denmark. I have a question about genetic susceptibility in humans. The fact that only 1 out of 10 infected with TB actually developed a clinical disease indicates that there must be some natural resistance against TB. What is your view on human susceptibility testing? Is there a place for that in the future? And could you target maybe the person she should be extra aware of developing clinical disease later?
I think it's that question is spot on. The question is there an immunogenetic predisposition?
Yeah.
So I'd like to get my hands on the PBMCs of the guy who sat next to the prison guard, homeless, shelter HIV-infected patient who didn't get tuberculosis, because I think there is natural resistance. It's actually been well characterized by a fellow named William Stead, working in the South in the United States for a number of years. And African Americans have higher rates when controlled studies are done than people of European ancestry. And so it does look very much so that there's a genetic predisposition. One of the most fascinating syndromes is that there is a subspecies called Mycobacterium africanum that's common in West Africa. And only West Africans get it. And if West Africans move to San Francisco, they remain at risk for M. africanum, whereas that particular microbe has not spread globally like all the other strains. So there's a host-pathogen relationship there that's going to be in my next grant application.
Bill, one of the things that I know you work on is identifying virulence factors in TB, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. How do you identify them? You must use an animal model, right? And you said before that none of them are any good. But you publish a lot of papers on them, so what do you do?
Yeah, so we joined the club of coming up with genetic acronyms for how you screen for virulence genes. My friend Eric Rubin came up with TRASH, transposon site hybridization, where he made thousands of mutants and co-infected animals with them and looked for the ones that were missing at the end of the infection.
I see.
And we came up with DEADMAN, which stands for Designer Arrays for Defined Mutant Analysis, which unfortunately the TRASH papers got published before the DEADMAN papers, so we were the true DEADMAN. But you can do these competition assays in animal models where you knock out you have a whole collection of mutants and you see which ones make it to the end of the day. And it's fairly easy to find mutants that are not as good as wild type in the mouse model.
What do you mean by as good? Replicating, causing disease?
Yeah,
all of that?
Replicating the organism will kill mice eventually, and it'll replicate to high numbers, and so you can monitor the numbers or just look for time to death changes. So it's easy to find mutants. There are lots of them out there. And some of those mutants have led to interesting vaccine candidates. Unfortunately, my work hasn't led to any of those, but we're still at it.
So you inject the mice, or you spray the bacterium into the respiratory tract of the mouse? Is that how it works?
Yeah, there are many ways to do it. In fact, you can buy these nifty little things that look like centrifuges. That is a giant chamber.
Yeah.
You can put 200 mice in there, and the device makes a mist that all the mice inhale, and then it's self-sterilizing, and you've got a nice uniform infection.
And then the bacteria replicate in the lung?
That's correct.
And it spreads elsewhere as well?
It's interesting. It primarily is a disease of lungs and spleen, and if you infect them intravenously, you'll see large numbers in the liver on the first day, smaller numbers in the spleen, and almost nothing in the lungs. And then a month later, it'll flip, and the bug's home to the lungs and to the spleen. And the basis of that is not known.
But these are active models, right? There's not latency involved.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you find mutants that are defective basically at proliferating and killing the mice.
Correct.
So, like what kinds of mycobacterial proteins do this? Give us some examples.
So we found a very interesting mutant that a pet project of mine. We found a mutant that was attenuated, and it lacked an adenylate cyclase. And after some study and a very bright postdoc, we realized that the organisms were making a lot of cyclic AMP, and we showed that the bugs secrete cyclic AMP into the cytoplasm of the infected macrophage, and that triggers it subverts the macrophage and tricks the macrophage into doing the wrong thing. And the wrong thing is to make a hyperinflammatory response. The bugs thrive in a hyperinflammatory response. It causes tissue damage, gives them places to hide. So that was a very interesting mutagenesis experiment that's led to some ongoing hypotheses.
So you said you could use these as vaccine candidates?
No, it was primarily, in this particular case, just trying to understand mechanisms of pathogenesis.
But it could be a drug target, though, right?
Indeed, yeah, indeed.
So then that brings up the question of how relevant the animal models are to people, and how do you figure out if a gene that controls virulence in a mouse is going to do the same thing in a human?
Yeah, so I think to do that, we need to start sequencing lots more strains and look at genes that are conserved across many clinical isolates and rule out the ones that show a lot of variability and natural mutation. One of the problems, is, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is that bugs aren't stupid. They have a lot of backup systems for the backup system for the backup system, and so you can, basically they have bifurcated and trifurcated pathways for essential functions. So it's tricky trying to find out what the essential pathway is for virulence, which would enable you to make drugs or vaccines.
Are there any questions from the audience? Anything from Twitter before we move on? Anything from you?
No?
So I have one last question for you.
Uh-oh.
If you could, what do you say for?
One last question.
Is that always the hour-long question? If you had one thing that you would solve in the rest of your career with TB, what would it be?
That's why it's an hour-long question. That's why I said, uh-oh.
Well, I would go for the quickest bang for the buck. What's really needed right now, Vincent, is point-of-care diagnostics. For diagnose and treat to work, you have to be able to diagnose fast. And so if you had a little device that you could take onto a rural area where the villager has just walked for 3 hours to get to the clinic and has to walk back that same night, you need to tell him or her yes or no. And you'd really like to be able to tell them, yeah, oh, sorry, it's also drug resistant. And also you have HIV and your CD4 count is, 15.
Right.
So that's where we've stumbled. And that's why the drugs aren't being utilized to their fullest because we don't have the right diagnostics.
Okay.
So it's the slow growth that enables the bacteria to survive in modern medicine today, because they grow slowly, so they circumvent our traditional forms of diagnosis. So exactly. I think you picked a good target. Rapid ID.
Yeah. Well, I've told my wife I may not make a lot of money, but I'll have job security because we got a long road ahead of us.
Yeah.
This is something you were interested in, John, right?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking if you were going to ask me that question, I was probably going to give the exact same answer, so I'll just take your answer.
Well, you can't do that. You can't answer the same way. Anyway, let's turn to John. John, I'm intrigued by part of what you do. I know you do several things, but the one thing I wanted to focus on is actually a statement from your website, development of informatics-based real-time surveillance systems that monitor population health from a variety of sources, ranging from clinical data to informal rumor-based surveillance. And I suppose that is what HealthMap.org is. So you're a co-founder of this website. Why don't you tell us about how you came to develop that website?
Well, I mean, the reality of sort of developing your own sort of surveillance tool as an academic, not a public health professional, sort of actually comes back to my PhD days where I either had two choices, do field work to get my own data or beg the government for data. So I tried the field work, got Lyme disease, I was studying ticks, so decided that I'm going to stop with the field work, I'm not cut out for it. And then I started begging the government for data on health. I'm an epidemiologist by training, so I wanted to get data on the population. I don't know if people in the room have had trouble getting data to do analyses on, but so anyways, recognizing that was a problem, moved to Boston where we could drink from a fire hose of data, of clinical data, and working with electronic medical records and data out of the clinical care, we could tap into massive amounts of data on human interactions with the healthcare setting, be able to do things, in a way that wasn't even possible with traditional public health data. So analyzing detailed demographic data, looking at patterns of transmission of, say, influenza in populations, being able to do things at a much finer grain, geographically and temporally, than was previously available. But then recognizing that kind of data is also siloed, and we were only dealing with data, say, in one city, in one part of the U.S., and we were really interested in global health, to turn to think through, well, what are the other data sources out there that we can tap into to provide at least some view of global public health. And we started to recognize that there was massive amounts of data on the web, initially from news media, but also blogs and chat rooms, this whole sphere of social media, that if one could tap into and organize that content, you could provide a view of global public health in a way that hadn't been done before. And that sort of was the genesis of HealthMap.org. We were able to get some attention from Google. They're, of course, interested in organization of content. So we were really able to build up this tool that really was geared towards providing a new light on emerging public health threats in the population.
How long ago did you build this?
So that was about 6 years ago, and that was before a lot of these new social media tools like Twitter and Facebook were really popular. And so our efforts have changed pretty dramatically. But initially, the efforts were really focused on news media. And there's some classic examples. For instance, SARS, some of the first reports weren't out of official reports of the Chinese government, but actually came out of local news media sources and discussion groups, a system called ProMed, which is essentially the world's first social network for infectious disease. So there's a lot of precedent for this concept that we sort of try to take to the public in a way.
So HealthMap.org is a website you can visit, and you will see outbreaks marked by a red pin, right, of various infectious diseases, all sorts. So how does the data get there? Is it manual? Is it automated?
So it's a fully automated system. So we have essentially a web crawler, data mining tool, that's mining tens of thousands of websites every hour looking for particular keywords about disease. It could be symptoms, it could be particular terms about a disease. And then we have a whole set of machine learning algorithms that essentially organize that content by its relevance, filter out the noise, categorize data by the disease, the location, and that's all done fully automated, and it's processed every hour. It's all done in 15 languages. But then we have curators, so it actually also represents a good training tool for public health students. Master's students are actually curators of the system, and they have both public health training and language training that are curating the data, making sure that the system works properly, and actually building up their own thesis projects out of the data as well. So it's a learning experience as well.
So who is the poor soul that has to discriminate flu or influenza from flu-like symptoms, which is every single infectious disease that earns a pin on your map?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I feel bad for her. Name's Jane Houston. She does a lot of that work. No, but there's a number of people they're involved, and yes, distinguishing diagnosis from symptoms is very critical. And we don't, of course, overcall something. If something is just influenza-like illness in a population, that's it's respiratory disease, doesn't get the influenza label. But our machine algorithms hopefully are at a point where they can distinguish those kinds of terminologies in a fully automated way.
So when Victor brought up his days at the clinic in San Diego, where he was pulling out of this population Mycobacterium bovis, and he was effectively discovering lymph nodes, how would your health map help Victor's potential new pediatric fellows really appreciate that what you're looking at is M. bovis and not just some infection that's causing inflamed lymph nodes?
Right. I mean, it's a difficult thing because our tool is not necessarily a diagnostic tool, but it does provide context. So a lot of clinicians, especially travel medicine physicians, are using the information from HealthMap as a context. So if a patient presents themselves with some form of symptoms, they can look back to the origin, the place, the destinations of travel, or even local context to understand what potentially might have been going around at the time. And that can be used as a diagnostic tool. The data from the electronic medical records in the same way, and actually Victor has actually been involved in a couple projects where the data that's being generated both from social media and the web, but also the clinical context can help define diagnosis in a better way.
So my day job is teaching medical students. Right. And, they always want to know what's on the test. And I keep telling them that life is on the test because, healthcare is cumulative. And so should we, in the basic science years, where they're learning about evidence-based medicine and the disease processes, should I introduce websites like yours and concepts like Victor's to the second-year medical student that's discovering microbiology for the first time?
I mean, absolutely. I think that the data that's being generated, not just from us, but a number of the sites are providing context in a way that wasn't useful. And the idea that the data around you should help inform clinical decision-making, I mean, it seems so obvious, but it just hasn't been part of medical education to date. But of course, it's incredibly critical. And then from a public health standpoint, that's the same thing as well.
That's public health.
Where the data that's being generated in, say, neighboring states, people aren't necessarily attuned to that. And to help inform sort of, decision-making at that level could also benefit from some of these websites as well.
So, Victor, what do you do with your freshly minted pediatric residents and fellows along these lines? Do you sort of introduce them to this notion, or they're taking information from a fire hose?
Well, I think it's intrinsic in medicine that people try to contextualize what they're looking in terms of epidemic trends and prevalence in order to make the right decision. For example, tuberculosis is the perfect example. If somebody is coming from a high endemic area with a set of symptoms, the likelihood that they have tuberculosis is so much higher than someone who's never had a exposure, and that helps us decide what to do with borderline skin tests and things like this. The study that we did with John's colleagues at Harvard had to do with strep throat. Strep throat is an incredibly common condition. There's 700 million cases a year worldwide, and there's some fairly effective clinical algorithms for determining, based on the patient's history and some simple examination features, their risk of disease. But of course, if there is strep going on in the community, that risk right now would be much higher. And if there hasn't been any strep in the community, then it's going to be lower. So we now have access to real-time biosurveillance information, and you could calculate a prevalence in the last 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, and bring in a biosurveillance aware component to the score. And we found that in modeling that, based on the actual results of the strep test that came back, during low-risk periods, you would save a lot of unnecessary testing and treatment. And in the highest risk periods, you would identify more patients. Actually, the algorithms are quite effective, but you can take them a few extra percentage points towards ideality.
So, John, let's have a hypothetical situation. Your algorithms, your computers pick up some Twitter and Facebook activity in a certain area, a very specific geographic area, some infection chatter. When would that go up as a dot?
Within an hour.
So it's not validated in any other way.
So this is where the work that we do sort of is, we're put in a place where we can actually do that kind of thing, where we can put up rumors or indications that there's possibly a signal, because we're not held to the same standard that, say, a CDC putting that up on their site. So it actually is a nice balance. So we can make a call ahead of time, whereas eventually the lab confirmation and the field investigation would lead to an official report that comes out, say, from the CDC or the WHO. So there's a really nice balance there.
So someone could follow up and look and see if there's
Absolutely,
something really
and that data
going.
is being fed in real time to these organizations, so that they can, and actually the majority of WHO investigations on emerging disease threats actually come out of these informal sources. They look at this information every morning and then make a decision on what to do next.
I have a question in the audience.
Case in point, I'm in upstate New York. There's a county south of Rochester, Livingston County. We have had somewhere between 10 to 12 E. coli O157H7, including a 30-year-old woman who developed HUS and TTP, who's nearly died. Her crit's up to 25. Her creatinine is down to 2. Her platelets are up to 68, and she's out of the hospital. So is that on your site?
I mean, not all this data, of course. I mean, there's the clinical data streams that don't necessarily make it to our site, but there's, for instance, if we talk about foodborne outbreaks, the number of reports that we get on our site probably is 10 to 100-fold greater than what's being reported by the state departments of public health and the CDC. Now, there's a mismatch, of course, because there's certain things that we'll pick up that eventually, don't get confirmed, and so it's very difficult to assess the specificity of our system. But we're in constant sort of evaluations of what's sort of being reported to the state public health and what we get from our systems.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's gone to the state. I know it went to the county. And they tested all the water, and gee, that was clear.
So let me ask you that there's been this story about the national parks and this very famous virus, the hantavirus. And so this is an unusual virus. So how do you decide whether or not it warrants a DOT? Obviously now it does indeed warrant a DOT because of the number of people that have been exposed through camping at this national park. But the unusual, how does it become dotable?
It's the dottiness of an event is actually very difficult to assess, because for every pathogen, that threshold is different. And it's very difficult to assess sort of the level. So one hantavirus case probably makes a dot. One case of, undescribed influenza-like illness probably doesn't. But what we found is oftentimes, at least at the news media level, that's already a predefined threshold. So anything that's worth reporting, say from a news media source, is probably already crossed that threshold. When we start getting into the Twitter sphere, I have runny nose. Is that a dot? No. So that doesn't make it. And that's where we start to aggregate data. So we
so
look
your
for
site
signals.
crawls on Twitter, going through every. There's how many Twitter people out there? There's like 400, 500 million.
So we're crawling through millions of tweets every hour. We have a website called Crowdbreaks with a group at Penn State, where essentially we're mining all the Twitter data in real time, organizing by the various syndromes, and making that available to public health. Now the question is that data going to be useful? We're still in the evaluation mode. This is sort of the promise of what the area called syndromic surveillance, where the idea that we're looking at these collections of symptomatic data to hopefully tell us something, the next anthrax attack or the next pandemic. Those, they're very difficult data sets to work with. I mean, there was a whole promise of, mining the sales of orange juice, across the country is going to tell us whether, we're going to find the next, pandemic, and that really hasn't played out. But I think there's still some interesting context that one can gain from Twitter that you wouldn't get from other types of data.
Aside from Twitter, what other sources? Facebook?
Yeah, we mine Facebook is a more difficult source because it's locked down, so it's only the people that decide to make their Facebook profiles public, which is definitely a breed of person, different than most people who lock it down. But all sorts of sites. I mean, of course, there's local social networks that we mine that are in other countries. Facebook isn't the top social network in other parts of the country. We work closely with Google on projects that mine search query data. So the amount of the times people search for particular symptoms might tell you about what's happening in a population.
So this is an ongoing work in progress. You're always tweaking the algorithms and looking at the data. That's part of what you do every day?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an emerging field, and there's a lot of work to do to validate. I mean, it's clear that there's already been some early success of some of these types of data, but there's still a lot to do to work out these signal-to-noise issues.
Can you give us an example of one way that it's been useful?
I mean, we've had a couple examples. One is around H1N1, where the first reports of the pandemic didn't actually come from the Ministry of Health in Mexico. As far as we can tell, the earliest reports came out of a local news media source in La Gloria, Veracruz, with a journalist talking about a mysterious illness that was affecting 60% of the inhabitants. And our system picked that up, and that, of course, that's the credit to the journalist, but the idea was these sources were providing a way earlier window. Now, the challenge so it's easy to sort of say that we're successful, but at the same time, the system, of course, wasn't sounding the alarm bells. We get many reports of mysterious illness every single day, and so the question is, how do we separate the sort of baseline respiratory conditions from the emergence? Right. So it's part success, part still challenge. With the emergence of cholera in Haiti, we were able to show that Twitter data actually was able to reflect the epidemic curve of cholera in a way that we could estimate the transmissibility of that new strain, and that mimicked very closely the official estimates. So there's been a lot of examples where we've been able to show the value of these data.
So the local Haitians were tweeting that they were developing cholera symptoms?
It's surprising there was an incredible amount of Twitter data being generated, whether it's coming from NGOs or people on the ground. Okay. I mean, it's Wyclef Jean talking about how he's there saving everybody, but there's lots of people that are out there on the ground tweeting, and that volume of Twitter can actually tell us something useful, surprisingly.
So are red dots or red pins dynamic? Do they come and go? Or so if something doesn't get substantiated, the dot goes away?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll remove a dot as quickly as we can.
Is that automatic, or is there some...
Well, eventually there's curators that look at the data.
Curating and vetting.
Exactly.
I'm curious, Bill, you ever look at this site?
No, I haven't, but I'm going to. Okay. I have a question. Does Google know before the CDC where the viruses are?
I mean, they have access. They're making that data freely available. I mean, does Google know pretty much everything about you before? Or Google know what's going to happen with the stock market? Probably. So I think the answer is yes, but in the attempt to do work in public health, that data is being made freely available.
So how does this intersect with privacy concerns? Let's say, there's a typhoid Mary out there who uses Twitter or Google a lot, and uses a PDA.
Yeah.
I mean, they know where the PDAs are, right?
Yeah.
Could that be used to track down someone who has a communicable disease that is a public health threat?
Absolutely. It gets into tricky areas of privacy. We have an app called Outbreaks Near Me, which essentially allows people to report in their symptoms and find out about events happening around. And so we're using that actually as a tool to reach out to people and send out surveys. This way, you can actually do a field investigation, so of a place remote around the world within seconds sending out a survey, since we know all the people that happen to be around that epicenter of that outbreak. It does get into some tricky privacy areas. Without that app, I'm sure many people know when you download an app and say, allow it to use my location, you're getting highly detailed information about that person as they move around. And what you do with that information, that gets into some hard areas to think about in terms of that use of that for public health purposes.
Yeah.
But it almost begs the question, is this for the greater good? And it's all about individual privacy concerns versus the greater good. And thinking about communicable diseases, you'd like to be, this goes back to personal responsibility. If I'm sick, should I tweet that I'm sick? Because you may be able to get a handle on it, and all of a sudden public health officials, physicians could say, okay, folks, it looks like the flu has reached a highly communicable state in our locale, so, follow stricter hand hygiene guidelines.
So that's a great point, actually. So we are actually, I'll just say one thing, which is we're getting into this whole area of altruism in terms of public health surveillance, sort of putting the public back in public health. We have a site called Flu Near You that we launched with the American Public Health Association, where thousands of people are reporting their symptoms on a weekly basis to sort of see what's happening around them, but also contribute to the public health environment. And so that's getting into that, people are doing it from their sort of public health responsibility. We're at 10,000 people. We'd like to be at, 1 million, but it's a start. And
because you could affect the outcome.
Absolutely.
You could actually control it. If everyone followed more aggressive hand hygiene, you could literally squash potentially an epidemic.
That's the hope. Yeah.
Victor.
Wow. I was aware of an example where asthma sufferers were creating an app which they had their position and then would report the severity of the symptoms and the number of times they were using their inhaler. And then this map was available to all the other participants in the network. And they could say, for some reason, the Upper East Side is a polleny today, and I'm going to avoid that. And that seems... I was going to ask John about... It seems that from a biodefense point of view, there would be some real importance in this kind of immediacy, because if we are attacked by some of the most common agents that people have concern about, anthrax or something, this would be deployed in a location, and then people would start to present with flu-like symptoms and fever, etc. And by understanding spatial or temporal clustering, somehow you could come to recognize that has happened sooner?
Yeah, much of the research in this space has actually come out of the sort of biodefense. That was when there was a whole legion of new researchers that came into the biosurveillance realm around this concept of can we identify an anthrax attack early. And a lot of the funding that's coming out now is actually out of DoD as well. So there's definitely that angle that's being played out.
So how does your site differ from DHS's Project Biowatch?
Well, Biowatch is the concept of course, environmental sampling. We're focused really on...
And they're not making those data available.
Well, they're not making the data available. That's one difference. And also the other difference is we're, of course, looking at things that are impacting humans at a given moment. Biowatch is something that's, a couple steps removed from that. we'd love to look at that data to see whether they link up, but we haven't so far.
Looking at the map here that Michael has on, and Australia has very few red dots. Is that because there's not much data, or the Australians are cleaner, or?
I mean, this is only reporting from the last few days,
Yeah.
but Australia has some things going on. I guess there is probably. No, I couldn't say,
Yeah.
but maybe Australians are healthier.
So going back to the biodefense issue, could someone game the system and simulate an outbreak where there wasn't one?
Oh, you mean the Twitter people?
The Twitter, Facebook, anything he's monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point. I mean, that was a question that came up 6 years ago when we started this, that, you know, you're going to get false alarms and then you're going to ruin an economy. That hasn't happened. I mean, now that we're live streaming this, I guess there's some Twitter followers that are going to thank for the idea.
But be arrested.
But so far, that really hasn't been the case. Most people are doing this for the right reasons, but you never know.
Yes, question from the audience.
Yeah, Mark Mizet from Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm interested to know when things hit the news, how do you, all of a sudden, everybody and their dog is twittering hantavirus. How do you know that there's not hantavirus circulating in just the most populous area where people are all sitting and tweeting?
Right. It's a great point. The idea is, there's all this just sort of feedback mechanism that happens as a result in social media around news, and you'll get sort of a news spike around, say, hantavirus, and then a lot of people tweeting about it. We, of course, have lots of mechanisms to filter for the news and understand the context for the tweet. I mean, if people are just tweeting information that's going on, that's something different than people describing their own health. Now, of course, there's going to be the whole concept of the worried well. A lot of people thinking they might have hantavirus, but we've worked on algorithms to try to adjust for that as well. But it's definitely a major issue in the use of this particular data.
So can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do the dots have any correlation with doctor's office visits? And if so, are they good visits, appropriate, or inappropriate?
We haven't looked at that. I mean, I don't think that our map is having that level of impact. You mean in terms of directing people into to emergency departments?
Well, the worried well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the worried well concept is being amplified by news generally, although we haven't seen it to a certain extent that we would see those kind of blips in ED visits. But yeah, I mean, generally, when you create mass panic around a situation, you're going to see increases, and I'm sure you've seen those kind of situations.
They're concerned parents, and it drives. In vaccine adherence and other things have been dramatically affected with measurable public health consequences.
If you want to see panic in schools, you mention two words: head lice. And you will see mothers go crazy because it gives the new meaning to the word nitpicking, which is literally what these poor parents have to do. And you don't even need social media because the phone tree for the schools work when there is a head lice epidemic, or not even an epidemic, just one child.
Fathers too.
And fathers too, yes.
I find it's a good time to go to ICAAC when there's a head lice.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Maren McKenna from Wired. John, could you, I'm thinking back to some of the early experiments with syndromic surveillance after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, when people were looking at things like presenting complaints at ERs and so forth. And as you said, they didn't really work. They didn't extract much useful data. Can you draw a distinction between those kind of experiments and what you're doing now? Is it just the statistical power of what you've done?
I mean, there's a couple different. That's a great question. So Maren's mentioning some of the issues around syndromic surveillance that we're tapping into, say, clinical data streams or different sources of information, 911 calls as an ability to look for signals in populations that might indicate some event. Now, it was very clearly shown that data, to look for the needle in the haystack of a major outbreak, was difficult. But what's happened over time is that these data have been actually more useful for what they call situational awareness, sort of understanding what's happening, say, with major acute illness. So, for instance, monitoring influenza season. Now, those data are actually they tend to actually show very clearly the flu season in a way that traditional data streams haven't been able to. And in the same way that, by extension, some of the Google search data or some of the Twitter examples have been able to replicate, showing that you can monitor a flu epidemic. So that's not all well and good. So everybody's trying to beat the CDC influenza-like illness ILI-net by a couple weeks. Eventually, we've got to show something better from that data. The Twitter data is incredible because it's so the sample size is much greater than anything that those people have worked with in the past. There's context. You're getting, still in a small sentence, you're still getting information that you wouldn't say from a clinical record, although potentially you could get more detailed information from a clinical record. I think it hasn't been fully shown. I think it's very easy to show that you can mimic a flu epidemic, and I think the research has stopped a little bit, and now everybody goes to the next data source. There's still a lot of work to be done to sort of realize the potential of these data, to go beyond it. But in some ways, it is sort of following the exact same path as some of that previous research.
John, what needs to be fixed? I'm sure it's not a finished product. What happens going forward?
In all honesty, the hope is that, of course, some of these data will be obsolete in 5-10 years because all healthcare systems, say in the U.S., will be hooked up to a central method of communicating data where public health will essentially be built off of electronic medical records or personally controlled health records. That data is obviously much more rich than what you could get off of Twitter or news sources. So if one could tap into that, of course, you still have the challenge of doing that globally. But that's really where we're headed. In the meantime, we're really focused on this sort of direct participation in public health. How do we get people more involved from the point of view of reporting information, but also, of course, that means also engaging people and getting them to care more about the health of themselves and their community. And that's really where we're going to focus on while sort of everything gets hooked up in the clinical setting.
All right, I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
And this actually ties in with something Bill mentioned about point-of-care diagnostics. And you mentioned on your website something about, you have to watch what you write on these websites, something about mobile phones and microfluidics.
I wrote about microfluidics.
Do you actually do that?
You really saw that there?
Yes.
No, but of course, part of it, and this is why I was sort of reacting to what Bill had said, is that, of course, the diagnostic tools are sort of the future. There's a lot of companies out there that are getting into this space, thinking about sort of low-cost devices to collect information, the whole concept of quantified self. And with that data, across millions of people using tools that they already use, there's real potential to monitor population health in incredible ways. So the idea of diagnostics via your handheld, I think that's where hopefully the space is going to move.
Right. So the idea is the microfluidics involve making, you put a patient specimen on a grid, it makes a pattern, a QR pattern that you read with a cell phone.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then there's no error. Yeah. Do you work on that, or is that?
I have a postdoc that must have written that in there because that's not my area of expertise.
Oh, okay, but I thought it tied in well with what you're interested, because that's what you're talking about, going out in the field.
So we should collaborate.
Guys should collaborate. Yeah. These podcasts do generate collaborations. Are you finished? Anything from the audience before we move on? Okay, Victor Nizet. All right, you went to Reed College.
Yes, where the late Steve Jobs dropped out.
How did you know I was going to ask you about that? Did you know?
Well, it was a great place to go because you got at the beginning of the Apple entry into the PC market, you could get a computer to use, just sign it out for the year, bring it back when you're done. And of course, I've been preferential to Apple since.
But you weren't there at the same time. You're much younger.
No,
you're much younger.
A little later. And I stuck it out for the whole time.
You graduated. Yeah. Oh, okay, very good.
That's one of the requirements to get into medical school.
Do you have to graduate from college?
Yes.
Is it true?
Most schools.
At UCSD, we accepted a 15-year-old this year for the MD PhD program. But she graduated from college also.
Yeah. You could be very young. Norton Zinder graduated from college at 18. Anyway, Victor, I also read your website, and hopefully what I read you're actually doing. One of the things you say you do is you try and boost innate immunity as a novel way of fighting microbial infections. Is that right? Did you do that?
Yeah, so I think my lab currently is about equally split between studying common gram-positive pathogens. I was always interested in what I saw in the clinic as a pediatrician, strep and staph infections, and deciphering their virulence mechanisms, and in particular, the way they avoid immune clearance. And then since I've been at UCSD, where we have quite a number of outstanding microbiologists and immunologists and cell biologists, I've become interested in innate immune system, antimicrobial peptides, macrophages and neutrophils, how they turn themselves on and off. And as an infectious disease physician, the vast majority of our therapy, you could almost say all of our therapy, is directed at the pathogen, trying to kill or limit the growth of the pathogen. But another way to think about the specialty of infectious diseases, it's those diseases that occurred because the patient's innate immune system had a bad day, especially with the bugs I work with. Things like staph and strep colonize all of us on and off, maybe 20, 30% of us at any given time, without producing disease. But they're fascinating in their ability to produce severe disease even in a previously healthy individual. And it's that dynamic that's fascinating, and trying to intervene in the dynamic by targeting the bacterial virulence mechanisms that resist innate immunity, or by actually going into the innate immune system and saying, I have a patient with staph circulating in their bloodstream right now. Wouldn't they possibly benefit from having a little bit more active immunity at the moment? We're very comfortable in medical therapy of having patients where we say their immune system's a little too active and they have asthma or rheumatoid arthritis, and we have a lot of drugs where we dial them back to the appropriate set point. My argument would be infectious disease is manifesting a situation where the patient's innate immune system, for whatever reason, maybe they were busy fighting a virus or they had a break in their skin, is a little bit down. And couldn't we boost that back up in synergy with antibiotic therapy to get in control of the infection? And then people always say, well, what about inflammatory consequences? And my response is that the uncontrolled infection is causing more inflammation than any drug would. So, we work on trying to do proof of principle in the laboratory, and we're crossing our fingers that in some future world, pharmaceutical companies would think that would be an interesting approach.
So you and Bill share the same goal, to have this remarkable diagnostic suite that works in real time, because the only way I would be comfortable at a patient to allow you to rev up my immune system is if I was certain that it was going to work. And so I have to be certain that the infection is doing more harm than your therapy is going to do to me. So you and Bill need the same magic tricorder from Mr. Spock to say, yes, indeed, we have to tune up complement.
Yeah, I think that these would be therapies that should involve a doctor, a good doctor.
Oh, good doctors are good.
In not over-the-counter types of therapies. But I think it, is an interesting angle to explore. And it's really just trying to mine the huge amount of data that people who are studying fundamental pathogenesis and fundamental mechanisms of innate immunity figure out how these systems are working at the molecular level that reveals potentially new targets. And some of them are elegant and complex, and some of them are actually quite simple. One of the examples is that we've done a lot of research on a transcription factor called HIF, which is called hypoxia-inducible factor. And it's been very well studied in cancer biology and vascular biology. It's the master regulator of the metabolic shift from aerobic metabolism to anaerobic metabolism. When you don't have oxygen around, you need to generate energy by glycolysis. And it turns out that white blood cells are very dependent on glycolysis for energy generation. And it always struck me that infections were occurring in places of low oxygen and often creating an essentially anaerobic environment. An abscess doesn't have much oxygen. These bacteria, like staph and strep that I work with, they love that. They'll grow better in this environment. And your white blood cell has to kind of go in there holding its breath and match up against these formidable pathogens. And people have been studying boosting HIF for treatment of anemia because HIF controls EPO production, and their drugs in phase 2 clinical trials seem very safe in chronic therapy for using this as a way to treat anemia. And we were wondering if those could be repositioned to stimulate white blood cell activity. And there's some antimicrobial effectors like antimicrobial peptides and nitric oxide that are directly regulated. But I think more importantly, it just provides ATP for the cell. It's trying to fight the bacteria, and it's getting signals from toll receptors and MAP kinases and telling it to make genes, to make proteins, to export those proteins, and phagocytose the bacteria. And if it is ever energy limited, that response is kind of blunted, and we're trying to make it optimal by providing enhanced ATP energy.
So infection has an inherent fitness cost to our white blood cells. And so if you could somehow give the white blood cell an edge by using this drug that can goose HIF production, you may then trade off the fitness cost that the bacterium is imposing on the white blood cell by fighting the infection and enable the white blood cell to win.
Right. I think, what we see a lot with bacteria like staph and strep, the reason that they can cause infection in a previously healthy individual is because they've evolved mechanisms to resist every aspect of our innate immune system. So they block chemotaxis, they impair complement deposition, they resist oxidants and antimicrobial peptides, they bind your antibodies on backwards. But one important aspect is they produce toxins, things like streptolysin O or staphylococcal alpha toxin or the pantin-valentine leukocidin for a subset of believers. These are very potent lytic molecules, and in fact, the phagocytosis of the bacteria might be the first step in that white blood cell suicide, because the one mechanism of bacterial survival evidenced by their virulence is that they kill the white blood cell before the white blood cell can kill the microbe. And then you can think about drugs that might block apoptosis, that might preserve cell wall integrity, that might stimulate autophagy, which is induced as a cellular defense mechanism when there's a lot of reactive oxygen species, as also potentially moving the set point in a way that benefits the host in this overall interaction. After all, we win the vast majority of the time. We have hundreds of millions of encounters with these microbes for a few serious infections. So often, just a little bit of help for the white blood cell or elimination of just a single virulence factor, sensitizing to just one aspect of the multifaceted complementary innate immune system, shifts that balance back in favor of the host. These therapies let's say you're looking at a virulence factor of the microbe that resists innate immunity, and you're going to take that out. That has the promise of being much more specific type of therapy than most current antibiotics, which target a broad spectrum of microbes, because you would be targeting a single molecule of the pathogen. And I think in this explosion of new information, a lot of it showcased at this meeting about the microbiome and its role in human health and in instructing and maintaining the proper balance of our immune system, therapies that are more educated and more specific might have tremendous advantage. I guess one analogy I like to make is cancer chemotherapy, decades ago was, and still, unfortunately, some of the components of it, just target rapidly dividing cells. And then you take out your gut lining and your hair and your white blood cells as a necessary side effect of targeting the tumor. But there's a new generation of very targeted cancer therapeutics like Gleevec, which understand a specific mutation in a specific cancer. And these therapies can be effective with a more favorable side effect profile. So people had talked about antibiotic therapy like, you hear it in doctors, just to be safe, let's give this antibiotic. And a lot of parent pressure. As a pediatrician, you really feel it. They want an antibiotic before they leave the office. And it's really hard to explain to them, just come back tomorrow, we'll see how things are going, it's likely a virus. And you have this dynamic where you wonder, couldn't we do this better, and wouldn't this have public health benefits in addition to benefits on the patient? Very alarming was the new study that showed that children who get antibiotics in the first several months of life might be more prone to obesity later on. Clearing out the flora that we've evolved to have, replacing it with other less beneficial flora that maybe doesn't extract energy from the diet as much, and you eat the same amount of food, and now you're gaining weight with all these attendant health consequences.
So has Mother Nature given us a clue by the complexity of the complement system? One of the great curses of the medical school education process is learning about complement.
Certainly.
And I think the complement system as a component of our innate immune system is really truly remarkable. And what we're learning from the current literature is the bacteria have really gotten very clever, especially when you look at the commensals that become pathogens like staph and strep. Yep. They have gotten really pretty sophisticated in how complement interacts with them. And so how do we figure out the right portion of complement to either inhibit or stimulate, or going back to your magic switch?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really fascinating. There's no doubt that complement is central to effective innate immunity. And one measure is that all these invasive pathogens tend to have polysaccharide capsules that in large part interfere with complement activation and cloak opsonic targets on the surface. Well, one thing I can say is that one of my former postdoctoral fellows is now one of the leading authorities in discovering the whole panoply of staphylococcal complement resistance factors. It's difficult to study because they make so many.
Oh, yeah.
And then the reviewers are like, well, you knocked out one and the phenotype wasn't that impressive. And, your work is mainly with the purified proteins. But I think just a simple experiment is if you take several bacteria and just have them in a test tube, if you add serum to staph, it'll grow better. If you add serum to group A strep and group B strep, which have been studied less well in this regard, they'll take off. we think they may actually be eating the complement. And it's really fascinating to begin to learn the specific resistance factors that could then be targeted. Another boon for this actually is in studying what the microbes are making to impair complement as potential therapeutics for complement-driven autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very fascinating area where if you think, who's better at toning down the complement system than these microbes that have evolved to deal with it over generations, and these little peptides that they're making can be used as a therapeutic for serum sickness, arthritis, lupus, and other disorders.
Could I go back to HIF-1A for just a minute? Because I wasn't quite sure. So HIF is induced under conditions of low oxygen.
Right. It's even better induced by microbes themselves, even under normoxia. So HIF is the shortest-lived transcription factor known. Its half-life is about a minute. And you're making it all the time, but it's being degraded as quickly as possible by a system which involves enzymes called proline hydroxylases and ubiquitin ligases. And it's those enzymes that can be targeted with drugs to prevent the baseline HIF degradation and lead to higher HIF levels. The reason HIF goes up in response to bacteria is that the transcript for HIF, the RNA for the transcription factor itself, is controlled by NF-kappa B and the inflammatory pathways. So I think it's actually quite an elegant system. You don't want to be inflamed all the time, right? Although we all know some people who are. You have your bacteria circulating in the bloodstream. Oxygen is high. And then HIF never accumulates because of this natural regulatory system. So a lot of their inflammatory activity is kept low. Then they get a signal to go to the site of infection following bacterial or host-derived chemoattractants. As soon as they leave the circulation, rapidly declining oxygen gradient. And then they can ramp up these innate immune genes and ramp up their energy stores to do battle. And then they see the bacteria, that stimulates even more HIF, and the process is done. After all, a neutrophil, they don't live very long, a day or two. When they leave the circulation, they're not coming back. Their goal is to go there, see if it's a real problem, and then, activate and destroy, or if not, undergo apoptosis so that they can contribute to resolution of it.
The ultimate cruise missile. They go off and then you decide whether or not you need to take out the target or not.
So your idea is to prolong HIF under conditions where you need to have higher oxygen because it induces genes that are involved in producing.
Well, I think it's just, there's a lot of, it has a role in angiogenesis, which is involved in wound healing. I think the safest approach at first might be looking, at topical applications and wound healing before you move on to more complex infection dynamics. But it's just an example of many. There's outstanding research going on autophagy, apoptosis, cytoprotective molecules, even the cholesterol pathway. Other things have surprising effects. Some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs affect the host pathogen interaction in a way that's useful. I think the bigger question is that the current antibiotic paradigm, we take molecules and we mix them with bacteria in a test tube or on an agar plate. And we determine whether at what concentration growth is inhibited or the bacteria is killed. And that's also what the information the doctor has from the clinician. And the problem is that the infection is actually occurring in a patient. And even before that patient saw a doctor, their infection is being treated by dozens of antimicrobials. The complement system is one good example. Antimicrobial peptides, oxidants. Many of these molecules can actually be studied in the same way a drug would. You can understand their half-life and pharmacology. A lot of people have studied and published all the different ways in which two pharmaceutical antibiotics can synergize or inhibit one another. There's actually a lot of dramatic ways in which antibiotics synergize or inhibit the activity of these antimicrobial molecules. And actually, Michael, you highlighted one of these earlier. We published a paper in our lab about 7-8 years ago showing that if you treat bacteria with bacteriostatic antibiotics, and we did this for gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria, we used chloramphenicol, erythromycin, sulfa. When you achieve bacteriostasis, the bacteria were no longer susceptible to complement, no longer susceptible to antimicrobial peptides, because those agents are targeting the dividing plane of the bacteria. In order to go from one bacteria to two bacteria, you have to weaken your cell wall enough to split, and that's the moment of vulnerability. So these drugs are effective in human medicine, but they're effective despite the fact that they're antagonizing our innate immune system. And then for somebody like Bill, it's just totally hopeless when his bacteria is dividing every month. Mine are dividing.
That's just it. And if you begin to think about the way antibiotics are studied in today's FDA with superiority trials, you almost have to ask the question, should you study a new antibiotic in the inferiority system using just with no drug? But is that ethically responsible? Asking how the immune system is able to handle it, and ask the fundamental basic science questions about what expression profile is going on. And this may be a way to get to Bill's issue of the microbe that says, let's make a message today. I mean, that's effectively what TB does. It says, okay, I'm going to make a message today, and that's why rifampin works. It's because I'm going to make a message today, and the rifampin says, no, you're not. And so you begin to look at these things, and it almost requires a paradigm shift in how we think about designing new antibiotics, thinking about targets. And I think the microbes that you work with, the staph and strep, which are these remarkable commensals that become pathogens in the right circumstance, and the innate immune system begins to fail in just one critical path. And it almost comes up with John's system, where we need, this Twitter environment for bacteria, where the bacteria are tweeting, I'm making this message now. I'm making this message now. And, his algorithms that are coming out for his health map may be able to help us figure out, okay, this is going to be a good target for TB. This will be a good target for a commensal gone bad or an intracellular pathogen. We really need the system biologist and the bioinformatician to really help the basic scientists begin to think about how to approach these problems.
Well, I agree with that. I think the more systematic and specific the therapy can become, the better off we all are going to be as patients and their caretakers. I do want to mention some good news is, after I gave that kind of downer about the bacteriostatic antibiotics, is that, we reason that there must be some examples the other way around, where a drug would dramatically synergize with the innate immune system. And the initial clues came to us from a clinician who now works a little bit in the lab, George Sakoulis, and his colleagues, who were looking at patients who were receiving therapy for very difficult infections like ampicillin-resistant, vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, or methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And these patients were being treated with daptomycin, which is an advanced antibiotic with still some activity, and still having positive blood cultures. And in the case of the enterococcus, they reintroduced ampicillin. And in the case of the MRSA, they reintroduced nafcillin. These are drugs that have zero activity anymore at all in the in a standard MIC or MBC assay. It's the very definition of the resistance. And these patients cleared their infections. And that made us think, well, daptomycin, adopts kind of a positive charge in the context of infection. And a lot of our innate antibiotics, like cathelicidin antimicrobial peptides, platelet-derived antimicrobial peptides, are cationic in nature, and that's how they target the bacterial cell wall. So we started studying the synergies. And it's striking that these beta-lactam antibiotics have an effect it can be just a very small percentage of their MIC, maybe a 10th or a 20th, to change the bacteria, affecting maybe gene expression or cell wall configuration, such that the innate immune molecules are much, much more effective. And in fact, in my opinion, from looking at the laboratory and what we've started to do in mice, a good drug for methicillin might be, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus might be methicillin. Not alone, but as an agent that can influence the susceptibility to the innate immune system. And it might explain kind of the superiority of these drugs against sensitive organisms, because they've always been working in concert with your innate immune system. And it's a property not shared by all antibiotics, like vancomycin in the same assays does not have that kind of synergy.
So how do we learn about what types of studies need to be done, and how can you get an indication that this is a standard of care, so you're not looked at like you're crazy, saying, okay, I'm going to give you some methicillin against this MRSA.
Right. Well, no, I think, there is an advantage in that we're talking about examining existing antibiotics to which doctors are familiar and hospital formularies possess. I think it's more that it's on its surface illogical that is the major challenge towards moving it. But I think, what I'd like to see is just a movement towards an approach to infectious disease therapy that's just more simpatico with your innate immune system, that you're recognizing what the ultimate goal is. Because right now it seems like there's a lot of in vitro testing. You develop a lead compound that has a very favorable MIC. You then determine whether that has toxicity against human cells. If it's not too bad, then you move to some animal models. Many of the animal models are kind of stressed. Honestly, in my, having a lot of experience with staph and strep, mice are generally resistant to staph and strep. You have to give them high doses. It's not hard for me to design an experiment where a loss of a single virulence factor or any antimicrobial agent with any activity looks pretty good in this system, which is very, stochastic versus what you need in humans. But to take that kind of paradigm and move it where very early in the drug discovery process, maybe the initial screening of the antibiotics was conducted in a matrix that would be a little bit more complex, or ultimately like a total artificial immune system, but maybe just serum or whole blood. And that's where you score your antibiotics on their initial promise, MIC, MBC, because they could be neutralizing a virulence factor. That would have no effect in a standard MIC, MBC assay, but could totally sensitize a bacteria to phagocytic killing. Or maybe they have a dual effect, where they both have some direct antimicrobial activity, but also increase white blood cell activity. And then your candidates are prioritized on a different metric, and that is always considered. I just think it's a more effective way towards drug discovery in the future, because the drugs might have more pharmacodynamic potential, which is we can discover some of that through smarter in vitro analysis, I think.
I'm struck by the need to go back to what we talked about before. The systems biology is going to be important, because if you want to interfere with innate responses, you need to know exactly what every molecule is at what level in normal responses and abnormal, and then when you interfere, see what the effect is, because we just can't look at the outcome, I think. You'd have to know the whole system. Is that too much to ask?
No, I agree. Yeah. I'm trying to recruit around me in my division and my program at the university a lot of excellent people who work at a systems level, systems biologists, and people who do, for example, mass spec profiling,
right,
and then people at the genomic level. I don't think I have the intestinal fortitude to move myself in this academic direction, because it's extremely challenging and needs an expertise. But I think, just multidisciplinary, systems-oriented approaches with the goal of developing, specific antibiotics that are optimized for the prevalent pathogens.
And that tricorder we heard about on the first day, which, if you remember, there's a Qualcomm contest to design one, but only to measure 10 different parameters. The real tricorder will measure thousands and thousands and integrate them and see what's going on, I would think. Well, I'd like to wrap this up by telling everyone that you can find this episode at microbeworld.org. We can find it at iTunes, and also at the ICAAC website, ICAAC.org. And usually we do email on our podcast, and if you have any questions about this episode or any of the others, you can send them to TWiM at twiv.tv. And I would like to thank everyone here today for participating. Bill Bishai is at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Many thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure. John Brownstein is at Children's Hospital of Harvard Medical School. Thank you, John. And Victor Nizet is at University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. Thank you, Victor.
My pleasure.
And of course, we can't forget Michael Schmidt, the Medical University of South Carolina.
Each one of these is an adventure, and I'd like to thank the audience for participating and coming on this adventure with us. One of our normal TWiMers is not here today, Elio Schechter, and what you see are basically three curious people, and we just ask questions of each other. We generally pick a paper, and this panel today met my curiosity. They gave as good as I got, or vice versa. It's been absolutely fascinating. I always tell Vincent that I learned a lot, and hopefully you all did too.
Curiosity that's our motto. Just be curious, and everything will come naturally. I also want to thank ASM for allowing us to do this. Communications Director Barbara Hyde, Chris Kondayan, Ray Ortega back there running the show, and also the ICAAC Program Committee as well. Thanks for listening, everyone.